Thiele whimpered. Her mother tried to comfort her, but the woman's voice was unnerved. She knew those bundles of blackness, like living night, would rip them and tear them.
Welcome to The Storming Journey, a sacred text reading of The Stormlight Archive by Brandon Sanderson. This podcast may contain spoilers for The Stormlight Archive through Wind and Truth.
Hello, everybody. Welcome to The Storming Journey, where we're covering Chapter 19 of The Way of Kings by Brandon Sanderson. I'm Elle, and I will be your Ardent for today's episode.
I'm Adam, and I'm today's Worldsinger.
And I'm Liz. I'll be your Veristitalian.
All right, so for today's world singing, I kind of wanted to talk in general about growing up in the world that we've grown up in, since the 90s at least, and the fear that comes from watching the news. I say this because a lot of, we live in a space, especially if you were growing up in the last 30, 40 years, where the news has kind of switched from being an evening thing to a 24/7 thing. So news has to generate content, generate stories a lot. And when I was growing up, it was right when it was when I was under 10, I think. And I was living in Utah, and Elizabeth Smart was kidnapped. And it was all over the news. So I was terrified as a child to sleep with my window open. And just terrified to sleep in general as a child, because this was just all over the news and all over the conversation. And it made me think about, different times where the news itself, where it's not something that I am experiencing myself. It's not an experience that I'm experiencing, but I hear about it and I have this empathetic fear, or this fear that I feel, based on what's happening. You can think about this when a lot of news stories are around crime or murder. And so people think that crime and murder is actually going up in cities when there's no data for that, but there's a lot more stories about it. And so our fear around it increases. And I wanted to bring this into our world singing because of, a lot of things that are happening loudly in the news, right? We have various things that the current administration of the United States is doing in various cities. We have various other things happening on the world, and it can be all very scary, and we can experience this, I don't want to call it an empathetic fear, but this fear that you feel when you hear of something else happening and you experience it in a since you don't experience it perhaps yourself, but you experience it in relation to that, and it makes you into someone who is fearful of the world around you. And I always have a mindset of if you put forward a fear, you always have to put forward an answer to the fear. But I'm going to leave it there to hopefully kind of begin our conversation of fear today in a way where we're thinking about how there are things that are fearful and scary in the world that happen to us individually, but also are happening to others that we experience when we hear about other people's stories.
Okay, speaking of stories, I'm going to give you the storm's eye view of this story that Dalinar experiences. Dalinar wakes up in a dilapidated barn with a little girl clinging to him in fear. The barn is soon invaded by a creature made of midnight essence, which Dalinar dispatches. At the main house, a woman takes them in, but two more creatures appear, and Dalinar fights them off with a fire poker, but is injured. They leave the house and find themselves surrounded by more creatures. Just when hope seems to be lost, two radiants fall from the sky. After the midnight creatures are defeated, the woman speaks with a mysterious voice and tells him to trust Sadeas.
That last line scares me, so I am afraid of it.
I think, Adam, that your world singing was really appropriate for this discussion on fear, because it does feel like Dalinar is not particularly scared throughout this chapter. There are moments where he is, I think, unnerved, but he is more reacting to the fear of the people around him, and especially this child. And I think that's really interesting, because oftentimes, if you're in an unknown situation, you can feel an element of fear. And this definitely seems like something that if I was randomly thrust into, I would be terrified, that seems to be the word of choice to describe fear in this chapter. But Dalinar kind of takes it way more in stride than I would have expected from him. So I want to know like what you both thought about Dalinar's reaction and his fear specifically in this chapter.
Yeah, I was just really thinking about that space that he's in, because he's going into these visions and he knows he's in the vision. And there's this like moment of like when you're in a dream and you know you're in a dream type of thing. And so that's why I was connecting a lot to the news, is because it's like you're not experiencing it yourself, but you are going through it in some way. But for Dalinar, I questioned why he is so. It makes sense of his character that he is so in the moment and so action oriented. But at the same time, he's in this vision and he could just sit there and wait. Right? He could just wait for the voice to appear at the end. He could just wait for it, but instead he engages with like the actual story that's happening. He engages in the narrative. He wants to save the woman because he kind of feels like it's his wife in some ways, right? He doesn't fully realize that, but there's this like tension of like it is a vision, but he really feels like he's there in some way.
Yeah, I think part of it is Dalinar's training and experience, right? When he's fighting the first midnight creature, he talks about how the decision was easy. The thing moved like a predator, so he couldn't outrun it. So he did this. Like he has instincts that let him be analytical in a situation where most people would be terrified. But then the part where he does start feeling like scared or upset is later when the child and the woman are both surrounded by monsters and he's watching them die and he can't do anything about it, right? Is this sense of powerlessness, which I think really ties into your world singing, that one of the reasons listening to the news can be really bad for your mental health is that you can't do anything with that information. Like, you know about all of these terrible things happening in the world and there's nothing you can do about it. So you just sit and worry and fear over it, as opposed to sometimes when we're actually in a frightening situation ourselves, we become more action oriented. I think like Dalinar is, like he has skills to deal with it. And so he's going to do it right to the very end, even when the Radiants show up, right? He's like, even though I don't have a sword, I'm going to join in the fight with this fire poker because I can, right? But when he's powerless is when he's actually afraid and asking, why are you showing me this? Why do I have to live this vision? I don't like it. Like, make it go away.
I think that kind of speaks to what causes fear in different people, because for Dalinar, it seems to be he has fear when he doesn't have power or control, maybe even. Whereas for the girl, I think it's more Celie. I think it's more a fear of like the unknown, if she knew what they were, and or a fear of harm. And the woman at one point like has a fear of this person I love, something seems to be happening to him, which is different than like control.
I was just gonna say, in your cold open quote, like part of the reason she's afraid is that she knows what's gonna happen, right? She's played out this scenario. She's probably heard about this happening to other towns. So the girl is afraid because she maybe doesn't know what's going on, but Taffa totally knows what's going on, and she knows it's gonna be bad, and possibly they won't survive. So they're kind of slightly different kinds of fear. When you're a child, you tend to have a lot more fear of the unknown. But when you're an adult, I feel like it's a lot more, I know how this is going to go and I don't like it.
I'm also thinking for this vision, like the use of this moment of fear to like encourage, like this is his 12th vision. And he mentions that like in the chapter, right? And it's why is the 12th vision, the vision of fear of the midnight essence and the radiance coming down? Like that order itself seems like fear here is used as a mechanism to kind of encourage the person that the Stormfather needed to pick in order to start the entire process, right? And so it makes me wonder a little bit about that. Like we have fear in the moment where it's like fear of response and it sends us through a thing. So like you respond in some way to a fearful moment, like when you're defending someone or defending yourself. So there's like that tiny like one-on-one fear, but then this vision itself is like utilizing fear as a way to teach someone, right? To encourage their growth or to encourage their thinking in a very specific way. And it makes me wonder that use of that within these visions is interesting in the way that like we have like one-on-one fear, we have fear that we fear ourselves in like a dark room, but then there's also where someone else can utilize fear to influence or affect people, right? Which is what the Stormfather or Honor is doing here, right? Where it's like, this was chosen a little bit, maybe not from a smart, deliberate sense, maybe from a more crazed, deliberate sense, from the last moments of your life, yada, yada. But in a sense, it's using fear as a mechanism of encouraging someone into a certain direction.
I think it also has to do with like, the reason this vision is helpful is that you experience how impossible it would be without the radiance, right? That like it takes the Dalinar right to the brink of like, you are going to lose, and you're going to lose your wife and your daughter that you have in this vision. And then the radiance are going to show up and save you. So it's kind of setting up that like, this is the solution to our fear. This is why we have the radiance, is because these things are going to happen. And you need to experience how bad it is in order to realize how necessary it is to have them.
And necessary in like such a very raw sense, right? Like the Radiants at the time are probably still fighting, they're squabbling, yada yada, but this is like such a pure reason to need them. You need these big blades because they're the only things that can fight these creatures. And it gives that like really hardcore, this is like why these things are here, is you can do all the things that you're doing in current Althkare, where it's like the blade gives you station, it gives you class, it gives you all those things, or in previous Roshar, where it's like the blade is a connection to a sprint, but like at the end of the day, it's these blades are needed for this specific reason, which I think is really a smart thing to pull out there.
I think to kind of flip this, it makes me think about how fear is used by governments and other organizations to control people that are within their jurisdiction or even outside their jurisdiction. And I think that like Honor, the Stormfather, may have been well-meaning in trying to say, hey, I'm going to basically scare you into doing the right thing. It ends up meaning that like in this case where he was trying to be well-meaning about it, Dalinar took the wrong things from his fear in general. His fear, like his response to a lack of control, led him to making decisions and trusting people that he might not have otherwise because he was reacting to his fears. And like even in the best case scenario of someone using fear to try to promote a good thing ends up kind of backfiring. And like, using authoritarian tactics is probably not good, regardless of your methods.
It's also the counterbalance, right? Where it's like it's an episode of fear. Your 12th vision is let's give them some fear to then give them the words of like trust each other, unite, right? At the very end, which he's saying unite through all of them, but this is a specific one where it comes out with that trust in distinction to the fear that you're feeling in the moment, rather than showing the viewer like a big moment of trust where all the Knights Radiants are working together. We see a few working together, right? But it's in a moment of fear. It's not in a moment of grand Urithru, right? It's not this like really big moment of trust. It's a distinction against a negative emotion in order to kind of push you into this positive space. And that doesn't work really well, right? As we see in real life, as we see here in the books, using that and trying to push someone in that direction and not really explaining fully is something that is a problem that comes up over and over again. And Sanderson's work and fantasy in general, right? That lack of trust, that lack of communication. And here you see how that guides him down a very, very not great path, which is great for narrative, et cetera, but like thinking in that way where it's fear and then it is at the end is like, you need to do the opposite of fear now, doesn't really help him get to where he needs to be.
And like, I think I could say in some, like, to some fairness to Honor, like, displaying trust is hard to do in a moment, or like enforcing the idea of trust, because like the whole point of trust is it's an ongoing pattern of feeling that you can trust somebody, that you have a connection with somebody, and it's hard to build that connection over a single moment. It's something that you have to show up for over and over again. I do think it's interesting that we're saying, like, at least in this instance, the opposite of fear somewhat seems to be trust. And I think that's a really interesting interplay. It's not like the opposite of fear is bravery or courage. It's the way that you work with other people.
It's also in this moment when, if I'm remembering my chronology correctly, which it's a lot of books, a lot of chronology, and I don't think Coppermine would be an easy way to answer this, but like when they're crafting this narrative that's meant to be left to the Stormfather, to whoever the Stormfather picks, right? Honor has had trust broken. He's had his relationship with the humans broken and kind of shattered and harmed, right? And so it makes sense that he's not fully willing to give all the information, that he's not fully willing to give that over. Even at the same time, where if he had given over the information, it would have actually been helpful, right? Like that's the thing that always frustrates me in the Cosmere, is like these shards don't give over their information, even though like it would be helpful if everyone knew, right? Like it would be helpful. It's always my frustration.
I wonder if some of that has to do with what Dalinar, what his instincts are when he first meets this little girl, right? She's scared. He's like, oh, there's going to be fear spreading around. He can't see them because it's too dark. And he rests his hand on her back and says, hush, it'll be all right. Right? There's a lot of times where, as a parent, you don't want to share information with kids because you know that, like, they're not ready to handle it. Like with your example with the news and your world singing, right? Like, I don't want to tell my kids about certain things that are happening when they're too young to deal with it because they can't do anything about it. It's not going to help.
Sesame Street actually has guidance on this. I have seen the graphics for it. It has what ages you are supposed to give information to kids about traumatic events going on in the world. So I will be posting that link.
Yeah. But even just ordinary things, like when I grew up, my dad was out of a job for about 18 months. And like, when do you share that with your kids? Like that's happening and we need to deal with that in our family. Just the ordinary hard things that you can actually do something about. It's not always good information to give someone because it creates fear and doesn't create useful action. So I wonder if part of this is like the shards don't trust humans because they don't remember human capacity at this point, right? They think, well, they can't handle this. And so I'm going to handle it and just not say anything, not share the whole information. I'm going to try to manipulate them into doing what I want instead.
I like that reading of it a lot because it returns humanity to the shards in many ways, while also showing how beyond humanity they are, and how that is like one of the core problems in the Cosmere, right? Is that these people have lived for way too long. They've lost their humanity along the way. And that's like the tension, right? And I think that's, but it's interesting though, pulling back in my bringing in of the news and Albert's bringing in of government in reaction to that, right? Like even humans who we are all living on this world, right? We forget sometimes that relationship. We forget all those things. And it's just, there's no perfect response, right? Like with being a parent, there's no perfect time to tell someone. There's also no imperfect time, probably. Like as a parent, you have to work with the child, and sometimes you reveal that information and you are choosing to reveal or keep that, right? And you can't force another parent to do the exact same thing as you're parenting. And so it's like, and that choice may have been a mistake, right? Like maybe you should have told the child earlier or something like that. And there's no way to know, right, whether that was correct or not. Just as there's probably no way for Honor to quite know if this fear tactic would have worked, or like this playing of this exact narrative in this exact moment would work in the way that he wanted. He just has to like trust in that way, like that his approach is working, or hope that it does, right? Because there's no way that he can learn, because RIP.
Do we have any other thoughts on fear in this chapter? Adam?
I think the only other thing that I wrote down was whether we think honor is fearful. Like in recording this moment and making this the moment that he records and, indelibly puts that into this entire process of these visions. Is he fearful? Is he in the background afraid, or is the Stormfather afraid? Right. And I don't think we get any textual evidence for that, but it was just a question that popped up when I was reading, thinking, in the broader Cosmere, in the broader background.
I think like one of the things I remember reading through Wind and Truth is like during Tanavast's perspective, it was like it felt like an ongoing sense of panic. Of like everything is slipping through my fingers and I have no way to stop it. And this like series of visions felt like a last ditch effort to try to like stop something from going horribly wrong. And so I think that like maybe not in this specific vision, there might not be textual evidence for it, but I think like by Wind and Truth, I think we do get textual evidence that like Honor is scared and has fear and is reacting rather than acting. And this vision, these series of visions are a reaction to his death and destruction more than they are I'm intentionally doing this to try to help the humans. All right, so with that, we will move to our sacred reading method, which today we are going to return to Lectio Divina. And for a reminder, the way that our podcast is implementing Lectio Divina is each one of us hosts will be reading the passage through. And then the first time we read it through, we will be looking for a word or phrase that stands out to us. The second time, we will look for Christ, God, an ideal, radiant ideal, something spiritual. And then the last time, which will become our Wisdom of the Herald section, is reading it through and finding something that we are called to do. So why don't we have Liz and then me and then Adam?
Okay, this is the section you chose, Elle. Every pasture needs 3 things: flocks to grow, herdsmen to tend, and watchers at the rim. I guess the thing that really stands out to me here is like, I love lists of 3. This is a great literary device. It's my favorite. I use it a lot in my own writing, probably too much. But this idea that sometimes you are each one of these, right? Like sometimes you're just there to grow and be oblivious to what's going on. Sometimes you're there to take care of other people. And sometimes you're there to like actually protect them and defend them, right? It's this interesting splitting of our roles, and you can't be all 3 at once. You need to be in a community to divide these things up.
I was thinking this may be an anti-Lectio Divina, but about what's not there. Like if I think about like, so you need flocks to grow, herdsmen to tend, and watchers at the rim. I think of watchers in a sense of observers, not quite defenders, right? And that's reading it very literally, because watchers at the rim can always be like guardsmen at the wall, right? Or things like that. But like in this reading of it, I was not thinking of it as people to guard or people to defend. It was more people who are watching in order to give the response. And there is no, in the 3, there is no like fighter against the opponent, right? Which would be a terrible thing to put into the text as fighter against the opponent. But and in the 3 work, but I just think it's I was noticing how that is not in here, how the fighting part is not in here, how the defending part is not quite in here, right? And as literal as one may want it to be.
The like phrase that stuck out to me this time was the herdsman to tend. Because the watchers at the rim gets used a lot later in the books. It becomes something that Dalinar remembers and it resonates with him. But that herdsman to tend does not come up again. And I think Kaladin brings this up kind of when he's like, I could be a surgeon or I could be a soldier. But I don't know. That herdsman to tend is just something that I'm thinking about and wanting to think about how people are tending to others throughout the Stormlight archive, because it is an extremely important part of a community. And I feel like in the different reading of Watchers at the Rim, where Watchers end up becoming defenders, regardless of whether or not that's the reading that like literally could be taken from this, the tenders tend to be overlooked. And that is just something I'm thinking about. All right, so for our second reading, after this, we'll be looking for something spiritual, connection, whether Christ, God, or a radiant ideal. Every pasture needs 3 things: flocks to grow, herdsmen to tend, and watchers at the rim.
I mean, we might insert a Mormon moment here. That like it feels like this phrase "watchers at the rim" is super related to the biblical phrase like "watchman on the tower," right? And which is used to refer to metaphorically to prophets, right? In Isaiah, it talks about I've set watchmen upon thy walls, O Jerusalem. So like that's the idea that your spiritual leaders and people who are telling you about what's going on are there for your protection because they can see from afar off. And we have this very Rosharan thing. The Watchers at the Rim kind of brings to mind a crater, right, that's protected from the storms. And then you have people up at the top of that who are exposed to the storms, but also can see things further away. And so it's kind of a prophetic role for the Radiants, which isn't one I've thought of so much. Like we think of, I guess because our closest Radiant is Kaladin, we think often of Radiants as protecting. But this is interesting, placing the Radiants in more of a prophetic role of watching over Roshar spiritually. And maybe we see that a little bit more in orders like the Edge Dancers, right? Because Lift spends a lot of time looking for those who are being forgotten, and warning that, like, we're leaving these people out. What can we do about it?
Your reading kind of just changed mine. So I want to do 2 different readings. The first is going to be the one that you changed it to. Which, you're pulling into Isaiah made me think of Jacob with the Lord of the Vineyard, and just how much that relates to here, where it's you may have to help me with this one, Liz, because I haven't read Jacob in a while. But do you want to take over and say what it is? Because I don't want to butcher it.
Hey, I mean, I don't. Let me pull up. Let me see if I can find it. It's been a while. It's not Book of Mormon year currently, so.
You've probably read through the Book of Mormon more recently than I have, though. So while you're looking up, maybe you could just like, I'll give a little bit and then you can correct me. So it's about, it's a story of a vineyard and it's all about grafting into the vineyard and growing the different branches. Elle, you can also hop in and correct me. I'm sure you've read the Book of Mormon more recently than I have. But it's about Lord who's looking over his vineyard, and it's a story about grafting and branching in. And a lot of people take it to connect to like the branching in of the House of Israel that Mormonism talks a lot about, and of connecting different disparate groups of God's chosen back into each other. And it works all with these ideas of how vineyards grow and how they can be connected. Liz, Elle, was that all roughly a good summary?
That's a good summary.
Okay, I'm getting good nods. It's a nice chapter. Like if you haven't read it in the Book of Mormon, it's a good one to pull out. That and I'm actually going to tell one of my law professors about the justice and mercy conversations, because he loves justice and mercy, and I'm like, there's good ones in the Book of Mormon. But anyway, one of my more favorite parts of that book. And what connected to me here was thinking about that flocks to grow, herdsmen to tend, watchers at the rim are all part of like caring for that vineyard, and of the Lord of the Vineyard who cares for it, right? And how he makes it grow. He's the one who cares for the flock or the vine trees, right? And then he's the herdsman who tends it, right? And then he's also the watcher to stop people from coming into the vineyard and destroying it. And it fulfills all those roles, which I think connects me to it's what I pulled out from Liz's connection to Mormonism. Is there's also a connection there, but what I was pulling out when Elle first read through it was the flocks to grow. The idea that we have flocks, but we are also flocks, is something that in religious thinking is something that I really like, because it's a humbling of being human. It's not a hubris or a prideful thing of being human, right? It's this humility thing where it's, you are a flock of God, so you are not the leader, you are the sheep instead. And I think that helps to keep us humble, which in a way helps to keep us kind of grounded. And so I was interested in, when we're reading this and thinking about a relationship to divinity, that idea that we're flocks, we're herdsmen, and we're watchers. Herdsmen and watchers are both like humans doing things, but a flock is like an animal doing things. And for me, that made me think a lot about the humility that comes when you have a divine presence in your life, when you believe in a higher power, and how that helps you understand your place in the universe, but also helps you not become too pig-headed in the universe per se, not to become too big of yourself. Because really we are just, simple dust in a very, very large universe. And you're just here listening to us, dear listener, in that big, big universe. So we thank you for that. But it reminded me of that humility that comes when you have a God. And I think you can still have that humility if you don't have a God figure, but I think it's a lot easier to pull out that humility and to live with that humility in a very positive and generative way when you have a higher being in your life and some form of relationship to that.
I think the thing that stood out to me, or like I connected with divinity, was the herdsman to 10, connecting it to the idea of Christ as a shepherd, which is a huge image, both like directly in the Bible and then like outside the Bible, what people have taken and run with. People like the idea, I think, of being a sheep. Like you were talking about Adam being one of the flock, and thinking about the relationship of what is a herdsman doing when they tend the sheep. Because like tending is kind of a very simple word, but also like there's a lot that goes into the process of tending for a sheep, let alone like a human child. Like, I only have one kid, but like it is a lot. There is a lot that you have to do to like parent a child who will have agency in the future in a way that a sheep will not. And just like thinking about the responsibility that a God figure, regardless of whether it's Christ or someone else, would have as a tender of humanity, just feels like a very big weight. So for this last reading, Adam's going to read it, but this will be our Wisdom of the Herald, so we will be figuring out what we want to take from this passage.
Every pasture needs 3 things: flocks to grow, herdsmen to tend, and watchers at the rim.
I liked you bringing this back to like raising kids, and I'm thinking about my teenagers, of course. My husband was doing our tax estimator for next year, and we realized we lose one of our child tax credits next year because my oldest will be 18, which is absolutely bizarre. I do not feel old enough for that. But thinking about how I might encourage them to move into a new role for themselves, right? Not just being like, you're just here to grow, and like, if you're alive at the end of the day, then we're doing well. But like, how can you become someone who watches after yourself like a herdsman, or is watching out for things that might be coming for yourself? Because I'm not going to be there for you always. Like, we're not going to be living in the same house 24/7, hopefully, after a certain point in their lives, right? And so needing to pass on those roles and realize, okay, how do you get them to transition to take care of yourself and to be your own herdsman and to be your own watcher at the rim? paying attention to things that might be coming for you. So I'm going to think about that. It's a weird time in my life with these teenage kids. It's very strange. So
I think weirdly, I'm like going the inverse direction of feeling like I need to let myself be a flock that is growing. I have felt like I've not been doing a very good job in taking care of myself, and I probably need to ask for more help in having someone help tend to me, because I'm not doing a good enough job on my own. And like being, as kind of Adam was saying, humble enough to acknowledge that I can't do it on my own is important to make sure that I can grow, that I can in the future go back to being someone who's tending or watching.
We're going to make this into a triangle, and I'm going to go in another direction of what I feel called to do. But I keep thinking about the word pasture at the beginning of this, how these are things that you need for your pasture. And I think I feel called to figure out what my pasture is exactly. Like, I know I have a lot of things going on in my life. I know I have a lot of different, like, juggling things, but it's like, what do I actually want my pasture to be? And how do I want to tend that? And what do I want to grow there? And what do I want to have develop in that space that I've kind of cordoned off for myself to make into this pasture? It also makes me want to figure out, though, where the wildlands are, right? Where's the other side of that pasture? Where is the spaces where I grow, right? When you leave that tended place and can enter into something that may not have exactly flocks, herdsmen, watchers, but has like other dangers to grow from and other spaces to be in. Because whenever I think about pastures, I always think of how it's taming the land. But at the same time, land does not always just need to be tamed. There are other ways to treat it and other ways to approach it. And so thinking about what my pasture is metaphorically, but also where the wildlands that aren't pasture are.
thank you for joining us today on The Storming Journey. You can support our work on this podcast by subscribing to our Patreon, leaving a review, or sharing the podcast with a friend. We hope you'll join us next week, and in the meantime, remember, journey before destination.